In 2010, a dinosaur fossil was found in China that looked very bird-like. It had feathers, a wishbone, and even hollow bones, but it also had teeth, and based on its beak-like mouth, scientists thought that this dino might have had a beak too. But there was no obvious hole in its skull where a beak would connect. So how did this feathered dino with a beak actually use it? Hi, it's me and welcome to my channel. When this fossil was first unearthed, it was clear that it represented a new species. The team gave it the scientific name Anchiornis hyena because it looked kind of like a hyena. They also named it Elvis the dinosaur because it kind of looks like the king of rock and roll. And they made the hypothesis that Elvis might have used his beak for display purposes, much like birds do today. But then researchers discovered that Elvis didn't have a notch in his skull where a beak could attach, at least not in the same way that modern birds do. You see, beaks are basically just the upper part of a bird's jaw, and in most birds, that upper jaw is fused directly to the rest of the skull. In order to get an obvious beak then, you need to start out with a skull that has a big hole in the right place. In 2010, when this dino was first identified, scientists were pretty sure that Elvis did not have a hole in his skull like modern birds. And if he didn't have a bony hole, then he wouldn't have been able to have a beak. But one scientist was not convinced. Matthew Lamina is a paleontologist at Carnegie Museum of Natural History who studies dinosaurs. He thinks that the skull of this particular dino was just crushed so much over the years that any hole had been squished shut. In 2018, he and his colleagues decided to look for fossils of Elvis with intact skulls. If they could find one, then they could learn more about what this dino looked like and how it lived. After searching through collections and asking around, they found a small partial skull in a museum in Canada. This specimen, along with a few others, seemed to have arrived at the museum in the late 1990s, but nobody had ever really looked at them. No one even knew they had these fossils until Lamina and his team came along. This new piece of the puzzle allowed the team to create a 3D model of the dinosaur's head, and looking at this model, they felt more confident that there was a hole in the skull, after all, though it wasn't exactly in the same place as it is in modern birds. Then they went back to the fossil site in China and spent weeks carefully cleaning and removing rock from another skull. And this one had a hole that was definitely in the right place. It was shaped like a semicircle, which is different from the roundish holes that you see in other birds. Still, this shape doesn't tell us whether or not Elvis had feathers. So Lamina and his team turned to X-rays to get a peek inside the dino without having to destroy the fossil. X-ray technology has gotten so good that scientists can now see tiny details inside fossils. From the X-rays, the team could see that this dino had air sacs connected to its nostrils. And air sacs are only found in birds today. And even more evidence that Elvis was a dino-bird hybrid, it had a structure called a furcula, which is just the fancy scientific name for a wishbone. So now we know that Elvis had a beak and feathers. So how does a beak work if it isn't attached to a bird-like skull? Well, you see, beaks don't always look the same. To figure out how Elvis's beak worked, the team compared it to modern birds with different beak styles. Beaks come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but they all share one thing in common. They are made of keratin, just like your fingernails. Now, this might seem weird, but look at alligators. They have beaks too. Sure, they're covered in scales, and they look very different from a bird's beak, but they're made of the same stuff. So in order to have a beak, you don't necessarily need to have a hole in your skull. All you need are some modified scales in the right place. So while they didn't have a bird-like beak, their beaks might have been more like an alligator's. And thanks to these new fossils, scientists finally got a glimpse at what those beaks might have looked like. Still, the team wanted to learn more about how these ancient relatives of birds ate. You see, beaks aren't just good for eating. They're good for grooming, attracting mates, and defending against foes. But the problem is that beaks aren't super durable. They're kind of delicate, so they don't preserve well. Most of the time, if a dino had a beak, all we end up finding are a bunch of tiny beak fragments. Even if you find a complete beak, it's hard to tell what kind of shape it was in life. After all, they're made of keratin, which doesn't preserve well. And beaks come in many different shapes and sizes, but only certain beaks are good for certain diets. For example, a long thin beak might be good for catching insects, but it isn't so great for crushing bones. With all this in mind, the team wanted to see how beak shape related to diet in both living birds and extinct dinosaurs. They took inspiration from a famous scene in Jurassic Park where a Velociraptor tries to open a door by poking at the handle with its sharp little claw. Velociraptors had very bird-like hands and feet. They also had beaks that were more like sickles than your standard bird beak, so the team recreated 3 different types of beaks and tried to use them to open doors, basically trying to simulate hunting behavior. It turns out that beaks with sharp points were best at stabbing things. And this makes sense because raptors with sharp beaks are often ambush predators, meaning they stab their prey quickly and unexpectedly. On the other hand, the thickest beaks were the best at crushing, so dinos with these kinds of beaks were probably not predators. Instead, they probably ate plants. The team concluded that Elvis likely had a beak that was somewhere in between. It wasn't as sharp as a raptor's, but it wasn't as thick as a plant eater's. And with its feathers, it probably spent a lot of time running around in the trees. In fact, Scientists think that the whole reason that this dino group developed beaks was because they were adapting to life in trees. In the canopy, there are lots of bugs, which means there was plenty of opportunity to evolve a beak that was good at catching insects. So birds aren't the only animals that have beaks. Dinosaurs did too, but they evolved separately from modern birds. While studying the evolution of beaks in birds, scientists realized that beaks don't always come from beaks. Sometimes they come from teeth. When scientists first found the fossil of this dino, they assumed that since it had teeth, it didn't have a beak, but now they've learned that it actually did. And it's not the only dino with teeth that also had a beak. Another relative of birds called a Confuciusaurus also had teeth. Yet another called a Sapirnithoids had teeth and a beak. And an ancient relative of alligators called a proto-alligator also had teeth and a beak. So clearly, having a beak doesn't always mean that you lose your teeth. Teeth and beaks can both be beneficial depending on what you're eating. So it makes sense that throughout history, lots of different animals independently evolved both traits. As for our dino, Elvis, or Ankylosaurus, the story doesn't end here. Turns out that there is a bit of debate as to whether or not Ankylosaurus should be classified as a bird. Some scientists think it should, and some don't. Regardless of what we call it, we know that Ankylosaurus was a feathered dino with a beak that lived in what is now China, about 120 million years ago. And now, thanks to these new fossils, we know that it might have looked more like a bird than a traditional dinosaur. Now you can choose to call it a bird, a dinosaur, or maybe even a dino bird. Thanks for watching this episode, and thanks especially to our supporters who help support this channel. If you want to learn more about how beaks work, you can check out this video.